Welcome to the third Sankofa conversation series on structural racism. My name is Kahrim Wade, and I am extremely delighted to be here with you virtually and to share the screen time with such esteemed guests on our roundtable discussion this evening. Tonight's roundtable discussion is entitled Black Lives Matter, Restorative Justice, Healing, and Transformational Change. But first, I want to take a moment, I want to take a pause to remember and recognize a professor, a dean, a mentor, a leader, husband, father, grandfather, and a friend, our friend, David Turkala. He was very much beloved by the campus community, even those he had to say no to because they knew he fought hard for them. As I reflect on my memories of David, he was a leader who would pound his fist on the table to fight for what was right. And with the same clenched fist, open it to shake your hand and invite you to lunch. You see, David was originally slated to do the introductions for this roundtable discussion this evening, so I feel very honored when I was approached to stand in. David was a staunch advocate and champion for equality here on our campus. He was a strong supporter of the Sankofa conversational series because he knew we, as a community, had to have this conversation, even though it was sometimes difficult. In David's words, he said, finding practical resolutions to problem which, when solved, help make things better for those to work and to do their best. Powerful words from a compassionate soul. Let's take a moment and reflect our personal thoughts about David, and please join me in this moment of silence. Thank you. I am now proud to introduce graduate student Nick Johnson.
All right, thank you, Kareem. Appreciate the introduction and thank you for bringing that energy into the space. I think it's a great way for us to start off, acknowledging and honoring the work of those who came before us. So good evening, folks. Once again, my name is Nicholas Johnson. I'm a graduate student in the Global Inclusion and Social Development program here at UMass Boston. And I have the honor of introducing our panelists this evening, who will be speaking on issues of race and restorative justice, a timely dialogue for us to have, not only in light of the last 4 years, but quite honestly, because of the last couple of hundred. For many, these last 4 years may have been a revelation of the racial violence that is systemically intertwined with the institutions that we take part in every day. But for others, it's a reminder of the US refusal to confront the conditions created for the repression and exclusion of Black and Brown communities. These are the results of generational traumas ranging from settler colonialism to the gentrification that we see across the country today. A prerequisite for any meaningful healing or strategies for justice must be reconciliation and accountability. We must overstand what has been to fully realize the circumstances of the now so that we can build what needs to be. And it's through our roots that we find and build on the knowledge that has already been designed for these tasks. Otherwise, we attempt to reinvent a wheel that won't take us much of anywhere. We can't reform systems built on the genocide and removal of a group and the genocide and stolen labor of another, but we can radically transform them. Indigenous knowledge provides us the tools to do so by providing alternative worldviews to the ones that we've been socialized to accept. Even now, there's a lot of rhetoric about communities of color who have saved the democracy, the same democracy that has marginalized us from its promises through its policies, false education, and agents of the state. And so those who are the benefactors and gatekeepers of these systems of oppression cannot be the ones to decide the terms of the blood, sweat, tears, joys, and triumphs of our ancestors. Our rush for unity cannot come at the cost of remaking the world for those who come after us. And so again, why should we settle for reforms when we are in a position to be the architects and builders of our own liberation? So now, without further ado, It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, activist Fania Davis, author of Race and Restorative Justice, Black Lives, Healing, and the U.S. Social Transformation. And of course, our panelists, Karilyn Crockett, the City of Boston's Chief of Equity, Jennings, former director of the Trotter Institute, Kim Richards from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And I now pass it on to our distinguished moderator, Dr. Kibibi Mack-Shelton, chair at the Africana Studies Department.
Thank you. Thank you. And especially for making me distinguished also. Everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. And especially I want to thank Dr. Tony Vandermeer and Dr. Keith Jones for organizing this conversation. Kareem, thank you for those words about our late David Turkler. We all miss him every day, forever and ever. I'm Kibibi Mack-Shelton, historian, chair of Africana Studies. And for me, it is such a blessing for me to have returned to work at UMB under what I consider one of the most progressive, forward-thinking chancellors I've worked under in my 30 years in the academy. I want to give a personal thank you for your support, Chancellor Suarez Orozco. This is just such a good time for us to be at the university to witness what's going on. In high school, one of my favorite albums, and I know most of you have never heard of this, but it was called Survival, and it was by a group called Grand Funk. And words in that, one of my favorite songs, I guess it was called I Can Feel It, but quote, I can feel it in the morning, I can feel it in the evening. Gotta make a new world, gotta make the old one right, unquote. For me, I'm just happy to be a part of contributing to this new world and making things right. Now, I know when folks hear the term Black Lives Matter, it is offensive to some, and they rebut by saying all lives matter. And I agree with them 1000%. But the reality is right now is that only white lives really matter. But what about Palestinian lives, Indigenous Native American lives, poor people lives? What about Black lives? Do we matter? What about my life? Do I matter? What about my 4 grandsons' lives? My 2 granddaughters' lives? What about David Turkler's grandchildren's lives? Do they matter? Will they all live to see age 65 years old? Or will they be dead from a traffic stop or from some mistaken identity? This, my listeners and viewers, is the worry that Kibibi lives with daily. As a historian, I find myself contextualizing that question. And I argue this question was not born in the 20th century. This is an old question. In the late 1400s, King Ansa of Ghana and his people, they attacked any slave trading ship that attempted to land at their shores. They were asking, don't Black lives matter? In the 1500s, King Alfonso of the Congo, he led his army to fight any Europeans attempting to enslave his people. It's because he was asking the question, do Black lives matter? In the 1600s, you had a small group of slaves and indentured servants in Gloucester County, Virginia, who said enough is enough, and they rebelled. Why? Because they were saying to themselves and asking, do Black lives matter? In the 1700s, right here in South Carolina, where I am, my home state, You had a bunch of slaves to meet at the Stono River, and it was from there they were marching from South Carolina down to Spanish-controlled Florida because they were going to be free. And they were killing any white person who attempted to stop them because they were asking, don't Black Lives Matter? In the 1800s, more slave revolts, rebellions, names that you're familiar with: Nat Turner, John Brown, Gabriel Prosser, all of them asking, do Black Lives Matter? We get to the 1900s, thousands of Black folks were lynched. They were killed just like somebody was stepping on a bunch of roaches. You had names like Ida B. Wells, NAACP, Jesse Daniel Ames, SCLC, Angela Davis, Black Panthers, all of them asking, do Black Lives Matter? We're in the 2000s. Why are we asking this question? How can we undo asking this question? How can we undo racism to create a new world? Tonight, our distinguished panel includes activists, scholars, organizers, government officials. They're here to give us and share their insight. Afterwards, I am asking everyone listening, watching, to please send your questions to the question and answer box so that our panelists will be able to lead the discussion around this. At this point, I am going to turn my mic off and turn it over to Dr. Fania Davis. And for those who may not know her, she is the sister of activist Angela Davis. So I've never been in such a great community of panelists ever. And I appreciate the work that you all have been doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kibibi. And this is an amazing panel. I want to echo that. Thank you, Kahrim and Nicholas, for your words, and also for your really powerful words, Kibibi. I am honored to have been invited to be in conversation with you at this inflection point in both the nation's history and in UMass's history. Thank you, Africana Studies. Thank you, Tony Vandermeer, Keith Jones, and all the other organizers of this event, the third of the Sankofa conversation series on structural racism. I wish to begin with a land acknowledgement that names and honors the ancestors of the stolen land where I live, work, and play. I'm in Oakland, California, the unceded territory of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. If you're in Massachusetts or other places in the nation, please share with us in the chat the names of the ancestors of your areas. Oakland's indigenous people are asking the city's non-indigenous residents, businesses, and agencies to pay the Shumi land tax to support the critical work of the Sogorea-Te Land Trust that is reclaiming stewardship of their ancestral land, restoring creeks, restoring different native habitats and wildlife corridors. The land tax I paid for in 2020 gestures in a very small way toward reparations. But if everyone in Oakland paid this tax, it could be significant. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to learn about who the original inhabitants of your land are. Perform land acknowledgements and also learn from them what action individuals and institutions might take to honor their sovereignty. What can UMass do as an organization to support sovereignty and indigenous stewardship of the land? I want to say something else about land acknowledgements. In invoking the original inhabitants of the lands where we stand, we engage in an act of truth-telling, the first step in restorative justice accountability processes. The United States is a post-genocidal land. This is an occupied land. And like the original harm of slavery, we have yet to fully recognize, take responsibility for, and take reparative action for this massive historical harm and its continuing impacts. Recognize, take responsibility for, and take reparative action for harm. These are the 3 R's of accountability in restorative justice. As we open this evening, I also wish to honor the 250,000 souls who have lost their lives due to presidential mismanagement of and due to the injustice laid bare by the coronavirus pandemic. The numbers of those succumbing are skyrocketing as we speak. May we assure their deaths shall not be in vain. I also wish Justin Root, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Walter Wallace, and countless souls whose lives were taken by police terror. May we assure that their deaths too shall not be in vain. And may we honor all those who have lost their lives because the knee of white supremacy and terror has been pressing on their neck for 401 years. I also want to acknowledge each and every one of you for choosing to be here today. I am here to give you props, Africana Studies, and all of you who are doing this work. You are engaging in a process to transform UMass into an anti-racist, health-promoting institution of higher learning. The implications of this are astounding. You are not proposing one-offs, not proposing a few piecemeal interventions, or a tick-off list of demands. You are utilizing holistic strategies rooted in anti-racist praxis and in restorative justice and indigenous healing sites to bring about transformation of the whole university community and to create a culture of anti-racism and healing. I don't know, but to me, it looks like you are on a mission to reimagine US higher education. And if so, you may be one of the first major universities in the country to do so. As you do this work of dismantling structural racism and beginning to heal the pervasive harm it engenders at UMass, it's important for us to know the truth about the sordid history of the US Academy. In this era, it has been important for every citizen to learn the hideous history of policing and of justice. Indeed, we can't really have productive conversations about race without being deeply grounded in this history. Education for liberation requires us to teach these silenced histories. And here are 5 salient truths about the Academy. The first is that the Academy never stood apart from American slavery. The Academy was slavery's 3rd pillar after state and church. The Academy was slavery's close kin. Second, slave traders and slave owners were college founders and trustees, and they looked to their slaveholder and slave trader colleagues to obtain funding. Third, universities were key actors in the colonial and genocidal project to legitimize and popularize the vision of white people as the sole legitimate possessors of the North American continent. Fourth, a primary purpose of universities was to prepare their young white male graduates to seek fortunes and futures in slavery and in the slave trade. Fifth, college founders extracted enslaved persons' labor to raise buildings, enhance institutional wealth, and serve students, faculty, and administrators. Last, though not least, US universities led the production and dissemination of hefty volumes of pseudoscientific research proclaiming the biological superiority of the white race and inferiority of the Black race. giving cover for the subjugation, brutalization, and massive harms against Black and Native American peoples. So developed and so elaborate was the white supremacy scholarship, though it doesn't really deserve that name, coming out of our universities, that when the white apartheid regime began in South Africa in 1947, they studied our country's history and laws, adopting many of our racist models to brutalize and subjugate Black Indigenous people there in South Africa. Of course, this is just a little about the origin story of the academy in the US. Ebony and Ivy by Craig Wilder is an exhaustive treatment on the subject. Slavery is gone, but the white supremacy at its essence survives in institutions of higher learning in the US, as of course it does all the nation's systems and institutions, none of which were left untouched. We are seeing harbingers of change. In this time of reckoning and awakening, almost 70 universities have joined the Universities Studying Slavery network in this country, including virtually all the Ivy League schools, and they are unearthing long buried truths about their complicity with slavery and the slave trade after hundreds of years. And they're also grappling with what kind of reparative action to take. Under pressure from student organizing over the last years, Harvard's buildings named after slaveholding presidents were honor the slaves who served those presidents. Harvard's official shield included the family shield of one of the wealthiest slaveholders in US history, who was also a Harvard founder and benefactor. Students organized successfully to have it removed. Universities are erecting monuments and memorials on their campuses to honor enslaved persons whose stolen labor built and maintained those institutions. Georgetown discovered it owed its existence to the sale of almost 300 enslaved persons. They tracked down descendants, preferential admission scholarships, and other reparation strategies. When the university stalled discussions on more significant financial reparations a few years ago, Georgetown's student body voted to pay an annual fee on top of their tuition to create a reparations fund dedicated to the descendants. Though these gestures and symbolic acts are bright beginnings, far more is needed. Perhaps they will become anti-racist and health promoting institutions. Today, in this George Floyd era, more than 30 jurisdictions around the country are engaged in reimagining how to ensure public safety in ways that Black lives matter. We're doing that in Oakland, where the city council unanimously voted to cut $15 million from the police budget this past summer, and also agreed to cut 50% of the 2021 police budget and transfer it to resource social services and community-centered security strategies. The Oakland Unified School District Board also unanimously agreed to take police out of schools and partner with the community in reimagining a transformative vision for school safety. Additionally, of course, restorative and transformative justice practitioners have been involved in efforts to reimagining justice, community accountability processes that do not rely on the carceral state. We in the US are also implementing alternatives to incarceration, as in New Zealand, where restorative community conferencing has rendered youth incarceration virtually obsolete. We are therefore in a time of re-envisioning public safety, justice, and education. After George Floyd was so callously crushed to death for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a reimagining wave swept over the nation. We cried, "Enough is enough, this must end. The time is now to reject structures and institutions that systematically brutalize, subjugate, terrorize Black people and people of color. The time is now to not only reject, but also imagine new futures where Black lives matter. Otherwise, the killings will never end. And so this is a time, this is an historical moment where we are being called to engage the radical imagination to engender new futures, to birth new worlds. And I am so grateful that I am here to see it. But birthing new worlds is no joke. It's very labor intensive. It's painful. And so your work is cut out for you there at UMass. Our work is cut out for us all over the nation. You will no doubt face great challenges and obstacles in this radical work of reimagining. We're actually seeing these difficulties right now in the Defund the Police movement. After declaring unanimously it would transfer police funds to support social services, it would essentially defund the police. The Minneapolis City Council just increased the police budget a couple of days ago for 2021. In Oakland, the Reimagining Policing Task Force is getting caught up in budgets and numbers and deadlines and producing reports that it seems to be losing sight of this larger task of re-envisioning. But I will do my best and gather community members to do their best to make sure that that does not happen. Even in the midst of challenges you will face in this great work, never forget, the time is now to build new worlds. The wind is at your back. This is also a time of facing our history. We are finally shattering the myth of American innocence, the myth that America is a citadel of democracy and that we have been divinely anointed to offer our way to the world. We are seeing that we are not a nation born in liberty, but a nation born in terror, the terror of slavery, of genocide, and of land theft. Today, we're seeing that throughout US history, police have served as frontline enforcers of white supremacy, brutally subjugating Black people. Slave patrollers torturing and murdering enslaved persons who resisted or attempted to escape. Then convict leasing era police enforcing Black codes, making it a crime to be unemployed, to spit, to speak loud in the presence of white men. Police delivering Black bodies to white lynch mobs. Today, this very same terror continues through mass incarceration and police killings. Today, we're seeing that our criminal justice system also has deep roots in slavery, from the slavery patrols to the neo-slavery, the Black codes and convict leasing, to chain gangs, debt slavery, to the legal system of segregation, and now today, mass incarceration and police terror. Abolitionists and restorative and transformative justice activists are reimagining justice as well. Many of us are realizing justice for George Floyd and countless others. We're realizing that justice for George Floyd and countless others requires more than prosecuting his killer. The problem is not a few bad apples. We need justice that will not just prosecute individuals, but that can transform systems, because it's the whole barrel. You are engaged in transforming UMass into an anti-racist and a health-promoting institution. You seek to build an institution that stands against racial injustice and that promotes healing as well. The juxtaposition here, the both and, is significant, and I want to pause and explore it for one moment. There is so much injustice in this world caused by colonialism, slavery, slave trade, land theft, genocide, racial capitalism, and neoliberal policies that enrich the 1% white supremacy, human supremacy, heteropatriarchy, mass incarceration, xenophobia, and climate catastrophe. Ad nauseum. We need justice. Our ancestors need justice. The ones to come need justice. And for centuries, these very same systems have been enacting unrelenting, unfathomable trauma to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, our children, our families, our communities, our earth. We need healing. Our ancestors need healing. Our children need healing. The ones to come need healing. Not just justice or healing. If we are to move into a future, it's got to be a non-binary proposition, justice and healing. Ours is a culture of harm, necessarily. It always has been. We were born into oceans of harm as a nation. Harm pervades and permeates our existence to the point we are on the brink of a planetary extinction spasm. We are experts at causing harm. If we are to move into a future, we must grow our capacity to be present in the world in ways that bring healing, wholeness, and holiness, instead of in ways that bring devastation, discord, and destruction. We're experts at doing harm, babies at doing healing. Epigenetics and trauma science teaches that if we do not process and heal trauma, it remains in our bodies and it damages our DNA. We perpetually reenact that trauma, and that trauma perpetually repeats itself cyclically. We are a nation born in multiple traumas, and for 400 years, we have pushed these traumas under the rug, and racial terror kept on raising its ugly head, keeps on raising its ugly head. We legally abolished slavery, yet the racial terror and white supremacy at its essence continued through convict leasing, chain gang, and debt slavery. We abolished those, yet the racial terror continued in lynching and Jim Crow. And after legally abolishing Jim Crow, white supremacy and terror continue today with growing racial health, housing, wealth, and education disparities, mass incarceration, and police killings. We will interrupt this terrible cycle, this cycle of terror, only when we give lots of attention to our healing and, of course, to justice. I acknowledge you for recognizing that we need justice and healing. This is an initiative that pairs both racial justice and healing, and this is uncommon. We have seen an unprecedented flurry of activity around reparations. Praise the Lord. Local initiatives in Asheville, North Carolina, and Evanston, Illinois, the Chicago Torture Fund, many others around the nation, the presidential debates, the multitude of conferences, symposia, articles, the new legislation. California just decided that it would establish a commission to study and give reparations to Black people. We've come a long way. This is great, but none of these initiatives, as I give any attention to the healing that is needed, and nor do they transform racial or seek to transform racial capitalism. On the subject of indigeneity, restorative justice, and healing, I am happy to see you name these discussions the Sankofa conversation series on structural racism. Sankofa, as many of you know, is an Akan West African symbol that calls us to look backward, to bring forth the seed of a new future. Let us look back to the past to fetch that which is useful for the future. When it comes to technologies of healing and peacemaking, indigenous cultures have unparalleled resources that are useful as we build new worlds. Restorative justice is inspired by a vision of justice decolonized. It is rooted in indigenous insights affirming humans' moral worth and dignity, their inter-identity, and their reciprocal responsibility to one another and to the earth. It is a vision of justice that predates, that challenges the slave trade, genocide, and capitalism. One of the more powerful things that you might do in your transformative work at UMass is to hold fast to values of radical respect, radical relationality, radical responsibility, and radical healing, while incarnating a deep anti-racist, anti-heteropatriarchal, and anti-capitalist consciousness. It is not enough to hold these values. We must be these values, embody them, so that we might transform ourselves in the ways we wish to transform our world. The Oakland-based Movement Strategy Center says, by starting in this manner at the end of the story, we practice the art of time travel, accelerating change by embodying and manifesting the values we seek in the world right here and now, so that the future is now. The vision we embody now is of a world whose individuals, groups, norms, and structures no longer dominate, exploit, or harm. This is a communitarian, post-racial capitalism, verdant world where everyone's needs are met. Everyone lives out their purpose. Everyone feels a deep sense of belonging. And everyone joyously and humbly makes peace with and heals themselves and their relationships with one another and with the earth. So embodying the future means being intentional about creating spaces that engender decolonizing structures and approaches that supplant existing systems of domination, particularly racial capitalism, white supremacy, punitive justice, heteropatriarchy, xenophobia, sexism, elitism, ageism, ableism, and human supremacy. The way we imagine new futures, the way we imagine our new world is crucial. If the way we get there relies on top-down approaches and experts and hierarchies of power, we'll replicate hierarchy. If the way we get there embodies power over instead of power with, we'll reproduce systems of domination. In other words, we can't get to a new place in an old way. Reimagining processes that are bottom up and that are restorative justice informed whole promise. Nothing about us without us is another central tenet of restorative justice. I hope you are engaging as much of the campus community as possible in your explorations about UMass's new future, particularly historically marginalized persons. I know you are. Shared leadership models will also advance the re-envisioning process. Restorative justice peacemaking circles rooted in Tlingit Takish traditions exemplify a shared leadership model whose ethos is communitarian, inclusivist, and accountability-based. The day of the single heroic individual leader is past. We are looking at shared leadership models. We are looking at models that draw on everyone's wisdoms. And circles do that. They are counter-hegemonic. Peacemaking circles are examples of egalitarian, democratic, generative, and embodied facilitated spaces where diverse communities can engage in dialogical encounter, deepen trust, reckon with the past, and breathe life into relations and structures of the future. To emphasize the indigenous ethos of restorative justice is not to sanction cultural appropriation. It is not. If white or other non-Indigenous restorative justice facilitators wish to incorporate Indigenous elements of another culture into their circle practice, respect requires at minimum fully understanding and explaining the meaning of the cultural practice and identifying the individual who authorized its use. That said, every human being has Indigenous roots, and non-Indigenous practitioners might conduct ancestral research to unearth the healing and peacemaking traditions and ceremonies and worldviews of their own traditions. White folk must also develop a complex and nuanced awareness of the ways in which they, as individuals, perpetrate or perpetuate structural and institutional racism. White Awake, an anti-racist, anti-capitalist white social justice organization, calls for nothing less than a wholesale identity transformation and process that releases the harmful, false, and fractured ways of understanding themselves as white people. White people need to demonstrate unwavering commitment to eradicate the scourge of white supremacy on intrapersonal, interpersonal, intergroup, and systems and intergenerational levels. Trainings and coaching sessions like the ones offered by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond will be immeasurably hopeful. Showing Up for Racial Justice, another white anti-racist organization, might also be a resource. That's SURGE. History calls us not only to reimagine public safety, justice, and education, where Black lives are no longer systematically brutalized, we also need to imagine new economic futures. The ravages of COVID-19 demonstrate that racial capitalism is incapable of meeting the basic health needs of its citizens. The cases of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Tony McDade, and countless others show it is unable to protect its citizens from police terror. Climate catastrophe teaches us that capitalism has neither the ability nor the will to protect our children nor the earth. These are each radical, systemic, and relational conditions that must be met with radical, systemic, and relational remedies. At the end of the day, we ensure health, justice, and safety by saying no to a way of life that exalts profit, whiteness, and extreme individualism, while saying yes to one that lovingly centers the well-being of all human and earth beings and the generations to come. Ultimately, we are being invited to reimagine what it means to be human, living in balance with others in the earth. Restorative justice circles exemplify the kinds of liberatory spaces where we can imagine and practice more just and healthy relational ways of being that will call forth new futures. Thank you.
And thank you. That was beautiful. And listening, folks, I heard words like mass incarceration, xenophobia. I heard words like reparations. And of course, this panel we have tonight, each time they speak, if anything comes to your mind, you want to add or you want to ask, please put it in the question and answer box for us. One thing that Dr. Davis just said, and I believe firmly in, just as Black folks are the ones who have to lead the struggle to liberate Black folks, to liberate the mentality of backward thinking of Black folks, it has to be led by Black folks. With the whole anti-racist movement, one of the most positive things that I found I've gotten from President Trump's administration is that he has awakened the sleeping parts of our body internally. And to see Blacks, and whites and Latinx and Asian folks all out there marching together against anti-racism. It shows me that racism will die, and it's going to be led by their white youth who are now struggling with their grandmothers and moms and their dads and their friends about racism. So let that few lead the way. Dr. Davis, thank you for leading the way. The way we're going to proceed now is that with the other three panelists, Dr. Crockett, who's with Boston, she's with the Boston Chief of Equity Office, Dr. Kim Richards, who's a community organizer with People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And we have, of course, our Dr. Jennings, who used to be here, and he's just this retired scholar out there making good trouble. So they're gonna each give a shorter talk. And after that, we're gonna have like a roundtable discussion. We purposely this time did not wanna have a conversation where we are talking at you. This time, we're gonna be talking among ourselves and integrating your questions and comments into the discussion. So please contribute to that box. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. Instead of me coming back and introducing each panelist, I am going to turn it over first to Dr. Crockett. And after she speaks, then Dr. Richards. And after she speaks, then Dr. Jennings will come back in. And you know, in between, if for some reason there's a pressing question, I may jump in there, but I'll let you three go ahead and put your information out there so we can get this talk on, okay? Dr. Crockett.
Terrific, Kibibi. Thank you so much for setting us up so nicely, and let me add my thanks to the chorus. Really wanted to recognize Chancellor Suarez Orozco, and also the Africana Studies Department in the UMass community here for just bringing us all together into this incredible and extraordinary space. To think about that there could truly be a focused and bold conversation on structural racism, not just for the first time, but to know this is the third in a series of really hard-hitting, probing discussions that are really meant to make us think very deeply. And on this point, Dr. Davis, my goodness, thank you so much for just bringing forth the harvest, bringing forth the good trouble, the good work, and a true north to ground us in a series of discussions and analyses that are not only of the moment, but call us into recognizing the importance of our history, of our yoked systemic struggles in the work we must do. So just really grateful to be here. So I'm Karilyn Crockett. I'm the Chief of Equity for the City of Boston, newly appointed in this role in the end of June by Mayor Walsh, the first time that the city has had such a role. It's a very interesting time in our city and our country because, as Dr. Davis has reminded us and told us, this is nothing short of a catastrophic moment in need of radical reimagining, in need of radical restructuring. My role as Chief of Equity was called into being very much on the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and represents the city of Boston coming into a renewed sense of reckoning and awakening in some ways. And so an awakening on the part of a mayor, a white mayor, who says he's calling into question the limits and opportunities for government, and understanding his responsibility, in his words, as a white mayor, to make sure that the city can try to do more. And in that respect, my appointment as a cabinet level appointment, coming with an entirely new cabinet, is to represent this structural shift. The idea that you can bring equity as a center of gravity, as an outcome, as a value and a process, and to embed that into all of the city's policies, plans, and functions is my charge. It is not a small charge, but it is necessary. I take this role very seriously. I am a Boston resident, homegrown in Dorchester, so I know the story. And I know how many times the city of Boston and Boston City Hall in particular has not only been an agent of racism, but has been on the wrong side of history. And so also as a historian, formally trained, I come to you as someone who echoes the words of our brother, dear theologian James Cone, who reminds us that without memory, there is no justice. And so the question before us is, how can we understand that the structural change that is our mandate, our demand, our birthright call can be made real now? It is not an overnight change, but it's a change that we must be calling forth constantly. And so I appreciate this point that Dr. Davis also made, which is making us make sure that we are grounding ourselves in an understanding of our history and the stories of our ancestors to now. And so the reality of the fact that from 1619 and truly before that, we all know, if we want to talk about the institutionalization of slavery, Black identity as a particular condition of bondage, and what that has meant from 1619 to 1868. I call that year as the year of the 14th Amendment, the legalization of slavery. That is a moment, the legalization of citizenship, that is a moment of thinking about our history of bondage, and to know that from 1868 to now is just 152 years, whereas 1619 to 1868 is 249 years. And so when I do that quick math, it suggests to me, as Dr. Davis has already noted, we have more familiarity, more experience, and more time in the bank with bondage than we do in understanding that fuller expression, emancipation, and undoing and moving toward freedom. And so we are very inexperienced in this. When I say we, I should say they. In the sense of what it means to create the institutions that will allow for our emancipation. And so in my role as Chief of Equity, I am mandated to call out systemic racism. And I understand racism as a belief system, as an organizing logic that will convince us that racial hierarchy in this descending order of understanding white supremacy would convince us that some people are not only not worthy and not only do not matter, but are not even capable. We know that to be a lie. We know that to be a toxin. In every single place we can call that out, from inside the academy to inside government to inside the private sector, does nothing but expand the truthfulness, which again is our birthright. And so I come to you as someone who is ready, because this conversation about the need for generational change speaks to me as someone who was not there for that golden era of the movement makers that I respect and stand on their shoulders, but as someone who was called forth in the 70s, those of us that came around when it was all said and done, we know the work was not finished. And so when I think about what it means to be a part of that post-civil rights generation, definitely not a millennial, but definitely coming through in the 70s and saying, there's much more work to do. So for my generation, the demand was for us to have access to educational opportunities, to jobs, to possibilities that our parents and grandparents couldn't even imagine. But they fought, they sat on the buses, they sat at those water fountains, they did all those things for us. And then so many of us like me had the benefit and the blessing to receive incredible educations, to go on to further ourselves through graduate school, through postgraduate study, and then find out these places were horrible. So we had incredible access to opportunity, masters, college degrees, PhDs, and then to find ourselves in situations and again, institutions that were so full of white supremacy and hatred for our very being that it just let us know the work was not done. So for me, this conversation about really getting inside of an understanding of restorative justice, really moving beyond just a lip service or discussion, but thinking about structural change and imagining new institutions that serve us in a real way has got to be the work. Every single day that I show up in City Hall and I sit with the mayor, we are there to remind him and to remind this entire structure that we sit in that the work not only is not done, but there is much, much more to do that is even so far beyond our imagination that we have to talk to other people. And so in this moment of triple pandemic, when we have called out, as we have in the city of Boston, we've called out racism as a public health emergency and crisis, we realize that that is a pandemic that has been with us for hundreds of years. Even as we think about COVID in this moment of pandemic and what that means, it's a public health crisis part 2. And then also the reality of this economic shutdown, slowdown, catastrophe that is also disproportionately affecting Black and Brown people, our immigrant communities, and our frontline workers. And so all of that is calling us into movement making, into the continuation of that work. And so I'll stop there, but just really so encouraged, Dr. Davis, by your words. We're encouraged by the charge and mindful so much of our sisters of the Combahee River Collective who really got their work going right here in Boston. And so the reality of that work let us know that the murders as well, murders of Black women in Boston, which really took Sister Audre Lorde, Sister Beverly Smith, Shirlane McLean, and others into higher consciousness, saying that we cannot just sit inside of elite institutions, ivory towers inside of the academy. We have to understand the consequence of the realities that we face and push ourselves into a fuller understanding of intersectionality, what that means for Black feminist intellectuals, for queer women to really call out racism, to call out classism, homophobia, xenophobia, ableism, all those things that talk about the ways that the power structure limits or expands us depending on our move. And that is the work, and that is the true north. And so just so much pride for me knowing that Boston is a place of so much pain, but also so much resistance history that is also our strength and needs to be brought into the conversation. So really honored to be on this panel and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crockett and Dr. Davis. My name is Kimberly Richards, and it is truly an honor to be a part of this Sankofa conversation. And I just want to honor the organizing work that many of you who both on this screen and not on this screen, the work that you have done over the years and continue to do to make moments like these happen. And more importantly, to support the ongoing organizing that is required both before, during, and after these moments. Dr. Davis, thank you for your invocation. Thank you for invoking the presence of those whose lives have come before us. Thank you for invoking the presence of, I speak to you from Mississippi. I'm in a small town north of New Orleans, Picayune, Mississippi, and we have colonized the word Shatta. The indigenous people here call themselves the Shatta. The colonized word is the Choctaw. So I am on the land of the Shatta as I speak to you from a small place called Picayune, Mississippi. So thank you so much for that invocation. Thank you for that invitation for us to remember, for us to live out the trueness of Sankofa and go back and fetch the struggle, the celebration, the joy, the victories of those who came before us. So I come to you as well. I bring you greetings from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, a cadre of anti-racist organizers who are based all over the country. We're happy to have had a history in doing work with many organizers right there in New England, specifically at the Haymarket People's Fund, under the leadership of Sister Carla Nicholson and the organizers that work in Boston. We've also have a long history of working with the Boston Public Health Commission under the former leadership of Barbara Ferreira, who is now on the West Coast providing leadership and talking about anti-racism there. That there was a time that the organizers at the Boston Public Health Commission had to understand issues of race and racism, because every indicator of quality of life in this country, you can predict the outcome based on race. I often think of the late Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, who helped me understand what it means to live in a race-based society. Because what Dr. Welsing says, if we take every letter of the word that we use to spell America, A-M-E-R-I-C-A, and we scramble those letters up, you get the phrase, I am race. We are a nation built on the imposition of the ideology of race. Therefore, every system and institution produces outcomes that maintain white supremacy. There is not one institution in this country that people that we have come to call white, and I very specifically choose to say people that we have come to call white, because when people that we've come to call white, when their ancestors were brought here, they were not white. They were English, they were German, they were Italian, but there has been a racialization process in this country that is a dehumanizing process. Those of us who are of African descent, it is in the holds of the slave ship that a Black identity was born. We were Igbo, we were Fulani, we were Hausa, we spoke Ga. But that middle passage experience brought us into a Blackness that I embrace, but that is a part of our racialization. That we lump people into Asian. That as I learn and understand Asian history, they might not want to be just lumped. That is a social political term that serves white supremacy. And so as we live in this race-based society, thank you for the history. Yes, we are a nation born in violence. We are a nation, these, as I often call them, these United Snakes. You know, you do this work, you gotta be able to laugh sometime, right? You do this work, you gotta be able to figure out, because see, we've all been dehumanized. So we look like human beings, but we have become human doings in a capitalistic society that has driven us to produce, to produce, to produce, and to produce outcomes that then have us at the bottom. So we at the People's Institute believe that if something was done, that it can be undone. Thus our understanding and undoing racism / community organizing. We believe that what has been done through that dehumanizing process is first how we, our minds, have been manipulated, have been created in a way to see ourselves as less than. And we know the history, we've got historians here on this, so I'm not even going to try to get into the history piece of it, but our history of our nation, our 3/5 compromise, that not only counted us as 3/5 of a human being, but did not count the indigenous people of this land at all. So that ideology, that mindset is baked into every system and institution and halls of the academy, where we are taught to acquire skills and tools. And having matriculated through the university and always being engaged in a process of decolonizing some of the learning that I got there, that, you know, we acquire skills and tools. Yet in a race-based society, skills and tools to institutions are like nails and hammers. They only fortify those systems. What we believe to transform those systems, it requires, you know, we often talk about, you know, Superman, and that element that weakens Superman, we call kryptonite, right? Humanity is like kryptonite to systems and institutions. How we bring a level of our human selves. So I thank you again, Dr. Davis, for talking about, we cannot talk about justice without our healing. That the repair of our humanity is central. If we don't repair our humanity, we will just go on to recreate the very systems that have oppressed us. Because we have been so socialized to believe that what is right is what is white. That we use language all the time. If you tell a little lie, we call that a white lie. If you steal millions of dollars off of Wall Street, you're a white collar criminal. But if you eat that rich chocolate cake, it's called devil's food. If you write that paper that wants to impact policy, it's the white paper. So we have to really examine the language that we use and how that language is a reflection of a mindset that many times this is not about our humanity, but about fortifying the very structure of white supremacy. So as an organizer, we find that if we're going to have anti-racist approaches, one, we must have anti-racist principles, and two, we must have a unifying definition of what racism is that we can organize around. So at the People's Institute, our working definition is racism is race, prejudice plus power. And we unpack each piece of that. We unpack what is race. We unpack what is prejudice, and we unpack power. And together, we identify that as what racism is. Because we're talking about the imposition of the ideology of race itself. And built into the concept of race is a bias in favor. So it's almost like race prejudice. So as organizers, we understand then how that race prejudice plus power manifests in every human being, in every system, and in every institution. And so what guides our work then is the embodiment and the constant ongoing work to embody anti-racist principles. And many of those principles have already been covered. So I'll just very quickly list them, and then I'm looking forward to our continued conversation. One is that we recognize that we live in a race-based society. That is not a debate for us. Two, that we must learn from history. As we've already heard, the history of this country, the history of the codification of race, the history of capitalism. We must understand capitalism because our bodies were the capital. So how we understand capitalism in a race-based society. Three, we must celebrate culture. And how we celebrate culture, which culture humanizes us as a way of life. How do we create a way of life that is liberatory? How do we create a life that elevates humanity? How we understand our role as liberated gatekeepers. The whole concept of gatekeeping. Gatekeeping requires that we understand what the arrangement of power is in this country. And what is our relationship to that arrangement of power? Either keeping it in place or liberating ourselves and those that have misused power in this country. Really looking at internalized racial oppression. These are anti-racist organizing principles that as an anti-racist organizer guide my work. So under internalized racial oppression, we look at both internalized racial superiority and internalized racial inferiority. And together, because many people will sometimes use internalized racial oppression and inferiority together. We say that internalizing the rightness of whiteness is oppressive and dehumanizing people that we've come to call white. And so we look at internalized racial oppression and how it shows up in our institutions, in our families, in our communities. We look at leadership development. How are we as a group of leaders? Many times we've been socialized and programmed to believe if you're a leader, you've been developed. Nah, there's always time for us to heal and to grow and to develop. So how do we, and connected to leadership development is accountability. To whom are we accountable? And how is that accountability demonstrated? And how we understand networking as we build a human net. And I see a part of this panel. We are creating a human net that works, a human net that works to transform and to heal and to repair the human family. And lastly, how we understand militarism, the applied enforcement of militaristic practices that we find in schools, that we find in institutions, that we find in communities. So these are just anti-racist principles that guide our work. Lastly, we are looking forward to being in partnership with you, to learning from you, because on Saturday, I was in a community event in New Orleans with Leona Tate, Gail St. Etienne, Ruby Bridges, and Tessie Prevost. Those were the 4 little girls that at 5 and 6 years of age, see, in this country, we put our children on the front lines to fight racism. So 60 years ago, November 14th, those 4 little girls were put in 2 public schools in New Orleans, France Elementary and McDonough 19. Many people only know France Elementary because of the Norman Rockwell painting of Ruby Bridges holding the hand of the marshal, the US Marshal, as she was entering that school. But at McDonough 19, the 3 other women now, young girls at the time, were ushered into McDonough 19. But I'm happy to say that Leona Tate has purchased McDonough 19. And in partnership with the People's Institute, we will develop the TEP. TEP stands for, it's the first initial of their surnames, Tate, Etienne, and Prevost. And that will be an interpretive center to support the development of anti-racist organizers, to share with people what the stories that their families went through to send those children through those lines. At that communiversity, the People's Institute, we will begin, we will open in spring of 2021, because it is about building anti-racist institutions. So we hope to partner with each of you as we create an anti-racist university that will be from pre-K to beyond, where we can work with families and children to build and support the development of anti-racist organizers. Because to transform this country, we believe it will take organizing. It will take all of us engaged in a movement for healing and justice. So thank you again for this conversation, and I look forward to hearing from you, Dr. Jennings, and the rest of the panelists.
Well, thank you very much. I've learned so much. I too am honored to be here with you and share some thoughts and learn from you. I'm Professor Emeritus at Tufts University. I left UMass Boston in 2000 at a time when UMass Boston was still in the midst of a debate about what it is and what is a public university and what's its commitment to social justice and to communities, especially communities that from which students came from. And so to be here in this conversation and see the movement, it really is, I really feel really happy for UMass Boston and for what this means in terms of broader conversations, in terms of the obligations, the responsibilities, not just public higher education, but powerful institutions of higher education towards programs of social justice. I also want to thank Dr. Fania Davis for her really empowering remarks, very inspiring, and Dr. Crockett, who I've worked with on some things, and nice meeting you, Dr. Richards, and seeing Kibibi again after a little while. This has really been, again, as I said, a very inspiring conversation for me. In terms of Dr. Davis's remarks on using a restorative framework to seek transformational change, 3 thoughts came to mind, and I want to share these thoughts with you. One is that any action, any strategy, any policy, any pedagogy should not be about simply changing racial attitudes or eliminating prejudice, but rather about dismantling as immediately as possible and radically as possible racial hierarchy and structural racism. That is the project. Racial hierarchy is a concept that is historical, it's cultural, it's economic, it's political, it's educational, it's global, it involves land and how land is used and for whose benefit. So this is a system of racial hierarchy, racial capitalism, racial wealth inequalities, and that is the target, that is the strategy. Strategies have to be pointed against that, not just simply eliminating prejudice. Some people might ask, well, how would you define racial hierarchy? And I think something that I just jotted down here based on this, the conversation thus far, racial hierarchy is a situation where Black lives don't matter except to subsidize white skin privileges. We have to remember that even in contexts where Black lives don't matter, that has been functional. Black lives have been functional for building a system of white supremacy and white skin privileges that we're still dealing with in all kinds of ways. So that's my first thought. The second thought that was generated in hearing the conversation is that the pursuit of racial equity is a key foundation for social justice. Racial equity is not simply seeking a piece of the pie, or as Dr. Richards made reference to, becoming the gatekeeper for the distribution of benefits in a very hierarchical way. Racial equity is fundamentally about the lifting and the advancement of humanity. And we cannot move away from that idea. It's an idea that has a lot of evidence in a sense. When we look at the history of the civil rights legislation, for example, a lot of it encompassed the pursuit, the struggle for racial equity. And we fast forward from the 1960 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and other legislation. We cannot forget that this legislation as a package led to the expansion of US democracy. And yes, there's a lot of resistance to the expansion of US democracy. But we have a situation where families and children, we have the rights of pregnant women around human services, non-English speakers, immigrants, people having the right to choose their own sexual orientation, worker rights. I mean, we have so many groups in US society that have not utilized, but have based their struggles on the earlier pursuit of racial equity. So I think that's something that that also we cannot lose sight of. And I think I'm really just reiterating in my own words what I heard the speakers before me. And I guess the last thought I would share with you is that restorative justice and transformational change morally, I think morally, not just intellectually, not just politically, but morally requires that we also challenge the long cumulative effects of racial and wealth inequalities and racism. Racial wealth inequality today cannot be eliminated or drastically reduced by overlooking its intersectionality, its history, how wealth inequality is not neutral, it's intentional. And again, only a framework of restorative justice and targeted transformational change in a very intentional way is going to move this society forward towards social justice and an expansion of democracy. So again, I just want to thank you for learning from you. And those are three thoughts that I'm going to be thinking a lot about based on what I heard tonight.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to give a shout out to all of you. I'm like you, Dr. Jennings. I learned a lot also. Okay, so I couldn't think of a better group of folks to have here to help us, to help lead the way for this university to become an anti-racist, equity, all-inclusive, health-promoting university. And at this point, I'm just gonna throw a question out there, and I just want to talk. I want to hear your insight. You are helping us, and I thank you. First question, in thinking about healing and reparations for Black Americans, how can higher education, like UMass Boston, us, assist in creating the political conditions necessary for a local and national program of reparations? Should I read it again? Again, thinking about healing and reparations for Black Americans, how can higher ed, a school like UMass Boston, assist in creating this kind of political, I guess, climate necessary for some kind of local reparations or national reparations program? How do you think we can help? And you all are free to unmute all your mics, because I want y'all to yak and talk.
Well, I feel like there's an essential role here to be played to underscore Dr. Davis's point about the necessity of truth telling. And I was so struck and captivated by this point that truth-telling is the first step toward restorative justice. I wrote that down. I was writing down so many things because there was so much to think about. But there's a need for, in a city like Boston, because we're so fortunate to have such a wealth of institutions, but UMass as our premier public research institutions really drawing from so much talent from the neighborhoods and the young people that are there, even the older students represent really the wealth of the city. And so there is a real need for more research and information. In Boston, we have been thinking very much about economic inclusion and about the topic of reparations and what cities can do. About 3 weeks ago, the mayor convened a table on reparations of mayors from across the country, including Mayor Haggerty from Evanston, as was mentioned, Mayor Mannheimer's team from Nashville, Mayor Durkin was also on the call from Seattle, and we also had Mayor Hancock from Denver, and a few other mayors who were there to really ask the question of what is it that can be done at the municipal level to think very deliberately about reparations as a way to repair and recognize harm done to African Americans and folks who are descendant of formerly enslaved people in cities. And we know that on the floor of the House right now is Representative Shirley Jackson Lee's legislation, HR 40, that's really trying to make sure that there's a national conversation in response to this question. So we do recognize that there is a need for a national and a federal, not only discussion, but action. But we also believe that at the local level and the level of mayors, that there is a movement moving across the country, and there needs to be more leadership there. When I think about the city of Boston and Boston's particular history on the North Atlantic as a place that has a very long and storied story of slavery and also making its wealth from the slave trade, or what that has meant for a city and a state in Massachusetts. It was the first state to legalize slavery, and then the first state to abolish slavery. And so there's a particular commitment and responsibility that we must have geographically to our role in this global story. And there's much to do at the, again, municipal level. And so want to make sure that we're continuing to throw our shoulder to the wheel in terms of what a city can do and what a mayor can do. But I think that there's a vital role to be played by universities, and particularly UMass. And would love to pick up the conversation or think about how we might be able to be in partnership to do some research and investigatory work here. So it's a tremendous question, and look forward to Dr. Davis's reflections on it, since it's so crucial.
You.
I don't. Yeah, I know. I'm glad to hear from someone who lives in Boston, because that's what I was listening for, and I don't really have a whole lot to add, to your answer, Dr. Crockett. I think it's you can there's legislation, at least not only on national levels, but also on state levels that one can look at. I don't know of any, there are all the cities that have passed reparations bills and have funds. So, I mean, there are models out there for cities. Now, universities, I'm not as clear about what universities are doing now. Does anyone else know about reparations?
You know what?
Go ahead.
Dr. Jennings. No, go ahead.
So two thoughts. One is, this is a question that really might require a lot of local lenses. In Boston, for example, Boston remains one of the most segregated cities in this country. And we've seen a lot of racial progress to, not enough, but Boston remains a highly segregated city. UMass Boston can begin looking at the challenges facing the city. One is segregation. Another major challenge, very wicked issue, is poverty. And begin asking itself as an institution, as part of a framework of reparations, how does it move forward in dealing with these issues, with these challenges, but ensuring that the voices of residents and community people are involved in the design of the strategies, are involved in the implementation, and are involved in the benefits. A lot of times higher education, not just public higher education, but higher education tends to be very colonialist when it looks at these kinds of issues. So I think, to me, one, part of a reparations framework would require higher education to be much more democratic, in a sense, in ensuring that these issues that are tearing people's lives apart are dealt with, but involving the very people whose lives are most being torn apart. And the second piece of a reparations framework has to do with the political economy of higher education. As I said, I left UMass Boston in the year 2000, so I don't know what the budget is right now. But whatever the budget is, how is that money being spent on Black communities, on Latinx communities that, again, are very, very segregated in the city of Boston? How many MBE contracts come out of the UMass Boston public budget? How many students, high school students, can look to UMass Boston without taking on exorbitant costs to get a higher education? So again, these are some of the pieces that I think apply to Boston that may look a little differently in other places.
You know what? Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Dr. Davis. You want to say something?
Oh, just a very, very quick thought. I think that, I talked about the university studying slavery network, where about 70 universities are participating, and they are telling the truth about doing a lot of research, taking responsibility for the ways in which they were complicit with slavery and the and they are, as I said earlier, they are looking at reparations and taking some reparative action, but not significant, last I heard. But there you have the largest collection of universities where conversations are taking place about reparations. You might want to check in with them.
Okay. You know what? This is great, because this is why we wanted you here. You are out there in the trenches, in the communities, practicing what we are trying to implement theoretically and practice in reality. So with saying that, this question is coming from a student. And wait a minute. Okay, so this is a new mission that we're trying to unfold. So everybody may not be on board yet. The question is, I want to ask, how can students hold professors and their peers accountable to this whole transformative anti-racist agenda we're talking about? Because not everybody is on board. Not everybody's collectively committed to this mission. Anybody want to have a stab at it? What you think?
What I would say is that one of the key things that students can do is, number one, be unified. That the system loves to see student groups that are not unified to then call a sidebar with and disorganize them. So the first thing I would say is it's really important that students are organized, that students have a long-term anti-racist strategy themselves and not just depend on the strategy that comes from the institution to then guide their work. That as was stated earlier, this is a long-term protracted struggle. The universities are socialized to wait students out. They'll be gone in 2 years. They'll be gone in 4 years. So making sure that they're, number one, embrace the role that they have around, they are the foundational bottom-up base that without students, there is no institution of higher learning. So you are the economic foundation of that institution. And so being solidly clear about that role and being unified as a group of organizers. I mean, we've seen, in our lifetime what Students United with some faculty and staff that are clear as well, what can happen to oust folks that have not been with the program. So we've got some historic lessons as well as some current day lessons of a unified student base. So organize.
Okay, and this is to you, Dr. Davis. Can abolition, circle, and restorative justice be truly honored and practiced within government and institutions? I'm not sure.
No,
I don't know the questions. I'm not sure if you understand it because it's not.
oh,
worded
yeah,
in-
I think I understand the question.
Okay. Okay.
It's very difficult. It's a good question. You know, how can we bring these countercultural values of you know, radical respect and honoring the equal moral dignity of every human being, honoring each human being's worth, you know, engaging in non-hierarchical behaviors and creating non-hierarchy. We're sort of, in other words, coming in with values that are the polar opposite of systems of domination, including universities, but especially justice system. So, you know, it's a very hostile environment in which to grow in these ways. So what I say, like when we do restorative justice work, it's really important for communities to initiate that restorative justice work within school systems. It's important for communities to always stay involved because it's so easy for systems or for approaches like restorative justice to get co-opted by you know, by racism, by hierarchy, by punitive approaches and values. So, you know, really holding fast to values of radical respect, radical relationality, radical healing, radical inclusivity is the first thing. And the second thing is to have community allies who bring you know, those values that are, you know, that counter values of systems and systems of domination in particular.
I would just add to that, and totally agree with everything that Dr. Davis and Dr. Richards have offered. It's so right here, calling students into remembrance that you are also the moral consciousness and center of universities. I sit on the faculty at MIT and urban studies and planning, and we had quite a turbulent spring this year because students really organized quite powerfully to call out our teaching content, the courses, the pedagogies, admissions, all the processes as being full embodiments of white supremacy. And in doing that in the way the students did, forcefully really challenging all of us to rethink all of that. And they were not satisfied with the response that they received from faculty or leadership. This is how these things go, we know. And to the students' credit, instead of just being sort of frustrated and either moving on to something else or dropping out, they came back and submitted their demands in what they said was the form and packaging that could only be understood, it seemed, by us. And so they put their demands in the form of a thesis. So they wrote a full thesis with footnotes, with acknowledgments, with a table of content, because they said for whatever reason that the white supremacist structure has formed you all in a way that all you can seem to receive and understand is academic armature, then we will give you our message in the form that you can receive. And it was explosively powerful. And it forced everything to essentially shut down, even though we were all in this sort of COVID Zoom world. An emergency faculty meeting was called. A lot of things happened behind closed doors, which I'm happy to share because I always want students to know that there is an effect. There's a ripple, even if you don't know. As a result, the chair and other leaders decided that we needed to have a statement around sort of standing up an anti-racist curriculum, and made a commitment to actually overhaul the entire curriculum over the summer, which we did. So I am teaching this fall, and I'm teaching one of the foundational courses, graduate courses, and that course had to be remade to respond to the students' demands that were delivered through this thesis. And it made the summer very intense, but necessary work. And so it really changed the discussion, because as you were encouraging, Dr. Richards, the students really leaned into their power and said they refused to come to a negotiating table with us until we understood all of what they were demanding and either agreed or they would withdraw. And so it was unbelievable. So we're still dealing with it. The work is not complete and it's not perfect. I share it not because it's a perfect example, but because it, for me, illustrates the power of what it means to be the moral consciousness and center of a university, and to flex that. And to know that whatever it means, that means it has to be new models of leadership that was discussed here, new models of engagement, and it is continuing to kind of roll through what it means to have us think about planning education in urban studies and analysis at the graduate level. So student power, I'm all for it. So it just, it just deserves to be called out, because so many times, leadership is unwilling or unprepared to deal with it. And that's not a new story. But the new story is how to recognize that this is a pattern, and how can we use that, or how can students use that as further gas and energy to mobilize.
Okay. With this next question, I'm going to put it in a hypothetical setting. With the four of you all, you're progressive, you're radical. Take yourself back to your college days. You think the way you think now, but now you're back in college. So this question is coming from a student talking about, I guess, his or her peers. How do we confront structural racism or legacy mindsets, with our peers? I mean, what would you do being progressive and trying to bring someone on board to understanding the needs to destroy racism, the needs to, et cetera, et cetera? What would you be saying to your peers on an individual level? Yeah, go way back, some of us, huh?
Yeah, I'll take so I was indirectly involved with the Young Lords at Hunter College as an undergrad. And this always came up because we had to convince our fellow students, getting back to Dr. Rich's point, that in unity there's power. And sometimes people start screaming at people because they don't share your idea, some that was tried and that sort of thing. But I think what was most powerful is asking people to look inside and ask questions about who they are, ask questions about why they feel hurt, ask questions about, do they have the, maybe not the capacity, but the interest, let me say, in seeing a better world, and how might that better world look like in terms of everyday struggles. So I think getting people to ask questions about who they are and the space that they occupy might be one tool that at least worked at times, as I recall.
Anybody else want to go way back? No, not that far back, but
And this will be maybe repetitive for what other people are saying, but I just felt like at the time in school, being really aware of what was at stake for me. And maybe it's because I'm an old soul and I was raised by my grandmother, and she kind of like talked to me a lot about kind of what things meant it also has to do with my family story of being, migrants from West Virginia and what it meant to be in the coal mines. My family, they were Black coal miners organizing, union organizers in the 30s. And I mean, they had seen a lot of stuff. So by the time they came to Boston in the 50s and 60s, their eyes are really wide open to oppression and being kind of locked out of economic systems, being locked out of political systems, even coming to the North, feeling that there could be more, and then winding up in Boston where there was infinitely less than they had even in the sort of segregated, like really extractive culture of West Virginia. So I came with that. And when I was talking to friends, a lot of times I feel like a lot of us were hungry for, what is it for? And so I was an undergrad at Yale. And like I said before, so many of us were given, there were so many fights to give us these kind of opportunities so we could have access to these elite institutions. And then, you get there and you're like, well, what are we doing here? Is it about trying to get out of this school and have a job that we're probably going to hate? Or are we trying to go to law school, which, I mean, like Dr. Davis can make that amazing and blow it up, which is great. But a lot of us were like, are we going to be locked in some kind of corporate like existence, or what was the sacrifice for? And I feel like that's a relevant question for students now, because they're also dealing with a world that is literally on fire. And if you have the fortitude or the discipline to get yourself through a training or school, this question of what are we doing this for has to be brought into the conversation, whether it's casual or, you're just Netflixing and chilling, or you're just, what is the what? And the what cannot just be getting through these places so we can perpetuate the systems and the organizations that are part of the problem. If we have the opportunity to have access, how can that be made to be, as Dr. Richard said, liberatory in a real way? And that's the call. And asking that kind of question, I know for me and for my little group of friends, made us think differently about school, what to do with that, and how to get out of not just this debt, which some of us are still in terms of student loan debt, but like, to what end is it, and how to connect that to what your family story of struggle or migration, or it's all in there. And it just makes you feel like you can really stretch out that that function, that possibility, because sometimes if you are, people of color and we get ourselves into these institutions, the first thing is they want to make it seem like you're the one or you're special. And that's the fallacy. And that's also the toxin to sort of, to just throw that up so you can disrupt it, to think about what are we really trying to do and what is it for?
Okay, you know what, this is great, because what I'm hearing from Dr. Crockett is, and I agree with this, it would be good for these students to even go back and talk to the elders in their family, talk to your grandmothers, talk to your mothers, talk about what it was that they grew up with and compare it to what you have. And the same thing, what you just said, Dr. Jennings, I meant with students, I guess another way too is, the courses that they choose to take. I don't know how many of you, when you were in college, you may have taken an African-American history course or a Black studies course of some type or whatever, but I find that with many students that becomes eye-opening, because they, I don't know, I didn't know that. The brain is not finished developing until the end of age 25. So when they say, I don't know that, they really didn't know. So, so great answers. I have another question here. What are your thoughts on the role of Black and Indigenous belief systems in dismantling anti-blackness and white supremacist systems? I'm so glad these questions are yours. What are your thoughts on the role of Black beliefs and Indigenous belief systems in dismantling anti-blackness and white supremacist systems? Good question. Come on.
In many ways, my response is both connected to that question and the former question, because when I went to Clark College. At the time it was Clark College, now Clark Atlanta University.
Oh.
And we were so influenced by folks like Willie Ricks, and organizers back in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And, you know, what we did is organize Saturday schools. Clark College was then right in the heart of what was called the Roach Street Projects. And so we organized, and so what I would say to the former question is to invite students to remember that in the larger society, they are not seen any different than the Black communities that either surround their schools or that they represent. So what does our connection, how do we stay connected to the very Black communities where people prayed for us and did fish fries and chicken dinners for us to be able to go to school? How do we stay connected to those communities and know that part of the what, as you asked Dr. Crockett, is for our collective upliftment. And so that collective upliftment, as I think about the, you know, the ancient technologies of our people, you know, be us, you know, African descent or indigenous of any land, how we can really recognize, number one, that they were ancient technologies that continue to have value today. And so how we can access them, how we understand it is important to call on the names of those that have come before us and to invoke their presence, how we understand the healing properties of music and dance and rhythm. Because again, systems and institutions will have us focus on skills and tools, but the ancient technologies of our ancestors is what humanizes us. So to be able to access that aspect of our humanity, for me, is a part of what the question invokes for me.
Yeah, yes, and I would add to that, you know, indigenous ways of knowing, of being present in the world, indigenous ways of knowing, and indigenous ways of being, indigenous ways of valuing, indigenous ways of creation stories, ceremonies, medicines. It's Black, indigenous, Native American, indigenous, I think these are sort of antidotes. These are medicines for our time. We do not know how to live in relationship with the land. We know how to extract from the land. We know how to use the land and abuse the land, but we don't know how to live in harmony with the land. We live in harmony with one another. So, you know, we don't know how to be in relationship. Of course, all indigenous cultures, Black, Native American, African, Native American, you know, have this idea of Ubuntu or Mitake Oyasin. I am who I am because of my relationships with other people, but not just with other people, with the earth itself, and with all living beings. I am who I am because of that. In our culture, that is not our way. We are who we are because, what is it? I think, therefore I am. It's a very individualist, it's a very deductive way of understanding ourselves as human beings. And that disconnectedness, that fracturing of the world, that extreme individualism, which came, you know, with racial capitalism in the 1500s and with modernity, it's atomized our world, it's pulverized our world, it's destroyed our world. And so, yes, I think that is, I think that, you know, African indigenous and Native American indigenous cultures will help to repair our world again, bring it back together. It's not that I'm saying we need to mimic or go back in time. It's just their incredible insights and values that we can apply to our lives today to create transformation. As I think it was Nicholas Johnson talked about earlier, those indigenous cultures have worldviews that we need to create the worlds that we're trying, the new worlds that we're trying to create. We can't allow all of the ways of thinking about domination. The whole idea is that we're here in this particular world to dominate and compete. That is the Western way. That is what has caused us all these difficulties. So yeah, medicines for our time. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And we almost out of town. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna go around and you all can each take 1 or 2 minutes just with your takeaway, just a final, whatever you wanna say. And with students listening, and with the respect and adulation they have of you all. I know they are gonna take away everything you said tonight, but go ahead. You can go in any order you want. Should I just do it?
I'll just quickly say to the students, you are the ones that history calls on when it's time to make big changes. During the 60s, during the 50s, I was the one. I was a youth then, and we were being called on to make the change at that time. So it was a children's march in Birmingham, 5 and 6 year old, high school students as well. It was those marches where they were facing the fire hoses, they were facing the dogs, and they were the ones who were able to bring the walls of segregation down in Birmingham, Alabama, with the sit-ins. That was college students. The Panthers were formed by 2 men, Bobby Seale, Newton, and they were only 19 years old. Dr. King himself was 24, 25 when he went to Dexter Baptist Church in Montgomery. The Young Lords, and that was mentioned earlier, that was a group that started like the Panthers, but that was started by youth. And you look at all over the world, and in every race, in every group of people, it's going to be the young people who will lead the change that needs to be made. And we need those fresh ideas. We need that fresh way of looking at the world. We need that energy of you. So I just want you to know that I honor you and I am here to support you. If you ask for my support, I am here to support you. If you ask for my guidance, I am here. And I want to do all that I can to assist you as we create these new worlds.
And I will just riff off of that and say, believe with every fiber in your being that a new world is possible. A new world is really possible. And what we do now is central to that new world. And that, as has already been said, that the spark and the energy of your youthfulness is what has always been a part of the way out, being back through. So those of us who have been on those front lines and support you in different ways now, commend you. We pray with you and for you, and we support your organizing. So continue to organize in your families, because so many times, many young people will run from home and be the radical political person in the school community. But so much of the radical organizing can happen and start right in our families, right in our neighborhoods. And so remember, those who you left are central to your future, and to organize at home just as much as we organize in the streets.
I'll go before you, Karilyn. First, I would reiterate everything that was just stated. It's so important. But one thing I would say to students at UMass Boston in particular, bring the community into the hallways of learning in many different ways, through not just outreach and recruitment, but also space, learning projects. It's critical for the future of UMass Boston, in my opinion, that students play a major role in becoming bridges between the university and the communities of Boston.
Agree fully with everything that has been said, and this point about generational change. what is required, that there is this way that we have been connected. And also this moment that we're in is absolutely about systems failure. When we talk about the murder of George Floyd at the hand of the state, police violence and the expansion of state violence, that is about failure. When we talk about COVID-19 and the fact that we are just hit this grim milestone of passing more than 250,000 deaths, that is systems failure. Racial capitalism is about systems failure. As was said, this idea that we have the system that cannot even provide for our most basic needs of everyone, that is systems failure. And so we have to have these things called out, because we haven't figured it out. We haven't gotten it right at all, not even a little bit. So the voices of folks who are living into that reality now, this generation, is what we have to hear. And please do not listen to people that tell you to wait your turn. Not yet. Listen, that's the lie. So I will say it here and say it clear that people have told probably all of us on this panel to wait at some time, probably telling us to wait right now on something. So that is never the solution. And it makes it very difficult for institutions, even like UMass, that are based on systems of performance, of merit, of hiring, of all of these kinds of structures that have built into them this idea of wait your turn. Part of the power that you have as students and as young people and as this generation is you do not have to wait. You see it, you know it. You can call a thing, and you can call on all of us as allies. I include and call myself into account for that. I'm right here in Boston, so I'm in the building in City Hall. I'm at home tonight, but you can call on me because we need you not to wait. It's that urgency of right now is the only thing that has ever really delivered for us and gotten it done. So I appreciate being here with all these wise beings, and look forward to just continuing the work for sure.
Wow, powerful. And the only thing I'm just going to add to the students in particularly is that I am Ida B. Wells. You are Malcolm X. We are George Floyd. I am Nanny Burroughs. You are Stokely Carmichael. We are Breonna Taylor. So whether you are an activist who's out there doing one thing, or a scholar who's out there doing another thing, or just someone who's a CEO in a company, you all can still spread the same message through the work that you do. Starts with consciousness. Thank you, my panelists. Seriously, I'm so happy I met you guys. And good night, everyone. Thank you for attending our third conversation.
Thanks, Kibibi. It's awesome.
Bye-bye. Okay.